Okay, so now we're in the Freightliner Cascadia. We're looking at all of the gauges, and we're going to go ahead and just look at the analog gauges, as well as the Freightliner has a couple of pages of digital gauges as well. So we'll look at both and identify what each one means and where things should be for normal operating conditions. So if we look, we're just going to go left to right. So if we look bottom left, you have your engine oil pressure. At idle, it should be 10 to 20 psi. Driving down the road, you should be somewhere between 40 and 80 psi. Just above that is your tachometer. You don't want to go much higher than 2400 RPM. That's actually really high. That will give you an over rev of the engine. And so you want to stay closer to the 13 to 1500 RPM is kind of the sweet spot. Just underneath that, you have your fuel gauge as well as your def tank gauge. The fuel gauge is marked with the white needle and your def tank gauge is marked with the blue needle. So then top right is your speedometer. Our fleet speed is set at 67 miles an hour. You know, you might have a variation within that, but you definitely don't want to go over 75, like if you're going down a hill or something, because that will send a overspeed to safety. Just below that to the left is your air tanks. You have a white needle again and a blue needle. The white needle denotes your primary air tank and the blue needle denotes your secondary air tank. Under normal operating conditions, you're usually somewhere between 110 and 130 psi. It does fluctuate as you go down the road, but you want to be somewhere between those numbers. And then the last analog gauge on your dash here is the coolant temperature. So again, normal operating temperature, you're somewhere between 190 and 220. You could go as high as 230, but then you start getting into the red. Anywhere in that range after you get everything warmed up, that's normal. Then if you go over to the right-hand side, there's a couple of extra analog gauges. The first one on the left-hand side is your suspension air pressure. So it's measuring how much pressure is on your airbags on your drives, and that is one way you can kind of tell about how much weight you have on your drives. As you get a little familiar with how your truck operates, you can kind of look and say, okay, I know about 60 psi puts me right at about 34,000 pounds, and so that'll give you a good rule of thumb for about how much weight you have on there. You definitely always want to have a scale ticket so that you know exactly what weight you have on there, but that can at least give you an idea of what weight you have on there. And then over to the right, you have applied air pressure, which is how much pressure is being applied to the brakes when you push the brake pedal. And so that just gives you an idea of how much pressure is going back there. If you have leaks or problems, you'll see that it may not react the way it should, or you may apply and notice that it's starting to get spongy and that the pressure is starting to go down, indicating possibly an air leak. So those are the analog gauges in the Freightliner Cascadia. There's not very many of them. They tried to clean up the dash and put a lot of them in the digital dash here in the info screen. There's a couple pages here. On the first page, you've got oil temperature. You know, it can really safely be anywhere between 180 and 250. If you're up above 300, that's too high. Then you also have your turbo manifold pressure. Again, somewhere between 20 and 30 when you're going down the freeway is normal. If it's less than that, probably it just means that the engine's asking for less power. You know, maybe you're going downhill, something like that. If you're pulling a hill and you don't see at least 20, then that might be the turbo's not operating as efficiently as it should. If that's the case, you can always call outside service and ask them. They can see usually if there's an issue like that, you're also getting a check engine light, something like that. Then you also have transmission temperature. If you're driving down the road, if you're pulling a hill, it can be anywhere from 190 to 270, or even a little bit above that, and you're still well within the operating temperature. So that's the first page. If you go down to the second page, you'll see that it actually gives you temperature profiles for both your front and rear axles. Both of those, you should be somewhere between 150 and 250 and be just fine. If it starts creeping up towards 300, then it might be something to take a look at. And then the final thing on the far right is, again, applied air pressure. So that one's actually a redundant one because you do have an analog gauge that shows that, as well as a digital gauge. But yeah, that's the basic gauge package for the Freightliner Cascadia. Hopefully this was helpful. Thanks.